You're watching the special Building Africa debate as we gear up for the World Economic Forum in Durban, South Africa next month. I'm Esther Awuni. Now, evidence shows that countries that have invested strategically in infrastructure are reaping the benefits. Today, we'll focus on the state of infrastructure in Africa as we explore ways the continent can plug its huge deficit and the opportunities therein. The AFDB says the investment opportunities in Africa are huge when it comes to infrastructure and would require an estimated financing of over $90 billion annually until the year 2020 to plug the deficit. Now, to discuss the state of infrastructure in Africa and the opportunities it presents, my guests are Adigbite Olakunle, Deputy Director, Lagos State Ministry of Waterfront Infrastructure. Also joining us today is Chamberlain Peterside, Managing Director, CEO, Excellent Capital Advisors. Also joining us is Bukka Kyari. He's the Chairman of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group. And last but not the least, joining us is Raj Kulasingam, Senior Counsel at Dentons UK. He joins us via Skype all the way from Cambodia. Gentlemen, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
For the first part of the conversation, we're going to be looking at three key themes: the role of Africans in building Africa. We're also going to touch, we won't get too in-depth into Africa's infrastructure deficits. We just look at what's been done so far and where we are right now, and also the role of development finance banks, institutions, especially when it comes to financing. But since we're having a Building Africa debate, let's talk about how Africans themselves are contributing to building the continent. It's often been said that Africans have the responsibility of championing, building the continent. We've seen in the last decade, we've seen a strong push for regional integration. We've seen a strong push for intra-African trade. Every year, heads of government, policymakers converge in different parts of the continent for economic summits, all brainstorming on how Africa can solve its challenges. So I'll just throw a general question around. What examples can you point to when we say that Africans are in the forefront of building Africa? Bukka, let me start with you.
There are a number of cases of Africans that have contributed to the infrastructure situation on the continent. I think of a person like Mo Ibrahim, who was a scientist that actually came up with the elements or the components of the GSM technology, and that propelled him into forming a wireless network in Africa, and at the end of the day ended up selling it, and he could have just gone around and played golf. But what did he do? He reinvested part of that by forming the foundation, which is at the forefront of pushing for the right sort of governance, political governance in Africa. Because when you talk about African infrastructure, we know that at a certain stage things used to progress over time. Today there has been issues of the dilapidation and the degradation of some of the little infrastructure that we have. But at the same time, when you look at the population growth and the growing economies of Africa, infrastructure gaps may be looked at as a challenge, but I would rather actually recast it more as an opportunity for those of us that are in the private sector to take a hold of and grow the infrastructure. Of course, Aliko Dangote is one of those that is, cement is one of the core ingredients when you consider infrastructure. Right?
Chamberlain, how do you see that story on your side?
My narrative would be slightly different. If you look at the finance model, traditionally we have relied on government budget to finance infrastructure, but over the recent years we've begun to see groups like AFC, which was created by the CBN and a few local banks in Nigeria. As we speak, there are quite a few countries that are members of the African Finance Corporation, and the whole idea was to build a financial institution that actually finances foreign infrastructure across the continent. They've done several deals. They just announced their financial results for the last year, and it was quite impressive. So we did those kinds of institutions. Now, in terms of telecom, just like Kerry said, MTN is an African company. Econet Wireless is an African company. Glo is an African company, just like Celtel. Those companies were actually created and formed locally within the continent before we began to see the advent of Etisalat and several other. So this is a trend that we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years, and I think increasingly we have to see that more in power We have to see that in housing. Those are some of the value chains that haven't caught up with Africa investors getting more embedded in it. Ultimately, I believe it's in the interest of Africa to design their own models that work, attract the requisite capital, and then form the kinds of institutions that would help drive that effort.
Okay, Adik, what is your perspective?
Well, I'll look at it from the angle of we have quite a large number of youths that I believe, if they take up the challenge, will move Africa forward. If you look at history all over the world, most revolutions, most industrialization starts with people taking it upon themselves that, okay, we've had enough, let's move this country. You can have the Chinese example, the South Korea example, but basically this is our land, and then we must find, just as my colleagues have said, we must find the right model to see how best to move forward.
Okay, Raj, let me come to you now. What is your perspective in terms of how Africans are leading the forefront in terms of building the continent?
What someone said earlier about local finance institutions playing a bigger role in the development infrastructure is very, very critical. So, for example, you have a number of sovereign wealth funds for African countries are now looking to invest some of their portfolios in country in developing infrastructure. I think that should be encouraged. The question is always a balance between investing locally and investing abroad and getting hard currency. But I think the push should be to try and get these sources of local currency investing locally. The second source of capital that's available in most African countries are the pension funds. And I think there is a lack of understanding and also ability to invest pension fund money into infrastructure, especially in early stage infrastructure. So I think some of the challenges that are faced is actually channeling money that's already there into local infrastructure projects. But it's not a question of money not being there, it's a question of education and also finding the right projects for these funds to invest in, because ultimately these funds are there to protect the future pension requirements of the citizens. Finally, I would say that the other thing that I would say that where Africans are investing in African infrastructure is that the diaspora is actually a huge source of opportunity for Africa, not only in the sense of money being sent back into country to invest in projects and companies, but also in returning Africans who've been abroad, who have the skills, who have the knowledge, who have the contacts to try and develop their own countries. And that's something that I'm seeing increasingly. You know, I have friends and also colleagues and clients who have returned to the continent to try and not only make money, but also help move their country forwards. And this aspect of the Africans investing in Africa is something that shouldn't be ignored and should be encouraged, and government should have the right policies to encourage that.
Well, Raj, that's a very good point you made out there. Raj just talked about, you cited the Africans in the diaspora and how they're contributing back to the continent. But let me also talk about, I want to talk about intra-African trade. Now, it's often been said that one of the biggest opportunities that Africa can easily take advantage of is intra-African trade. But according to Afreximbank, that still hovers and has been hovering for the last decade at just 15%. Why do you think Africa is having trouble trading with itself? Chamberlain, you want to go first?
Yes, you have to look at the kinds of products and services that various African countries, produce. We are primarily monoproduct economies, raw materials, even in their unprocessed form. Nigeria produces crude oil, just as several other countries do. Ghana grows cocoa, just as Nigeria does, and Cote d'Ivoire does. Now, you haven't had the emergence of, African branded products. If we did, then there might have been much, increased trading. Look at communication. Look at, flights between several African countries. Until recently, you never had direct flights. If you wanted to fly to East African country, you had to go to somewhere else and stop over. Communication, adding value to the products, and providing access and information. Those are the key attributes that you need to get right to be able to share information and get countries trading amongst themselves.
Value-added goods.
And then the
especially.
financing also is a very key component. If you were to trade with another African country, would you have trade finance? Would you have letters of credits that will be honored between those two African countries? I think our banking system has begun to evolve, whereby we have local Nigerian banks that operate in several African countries, UBA, Zenith Bank. I think that is all going to foster intra-African trade ultimately.
What is your perspective? I mean, we have all these economic summits where these governments, they meet, at least very often in the course of each single year, and you wonder, why can't we hash out something where we can trade better with amongst ourselves?
Yes, I think it's of course rooted in history. When you talk about the Anglo-Saxon or the former English colonies versus the French colonized nations, etc., etc., you go through that. There is that tendency of wrapping yourself around that historical context. But I think the fundamental thing for intra-Africa trade to grow is for the African Union and the African heads of states to realize that the less friction there is in transactions between me and my neighbor in Africa, the higher the impact of those trade. It would bring higher social and economic impact than, for example, trading with people across the oceans. And once that realization hit us, then it would be in our best self-interest for us to increase the velocity of trade between and amongst African countries. I think case in point is where, like Peter Said had mentioned, the growing of Nigerian banks into other African countries. Have we seen other African banks in Nigeria? Of course, Stanbic is there. But short of that, it's coming from South Africa. But we need to open ourselves up. There is an aspect that is so universal and so global that we forget, which is in the IT sector. The young people, young startups in Abuja or Kaduna or Mombasa or wherever, they tend to develop apps for the entire continent or the whole world. And the take-up of those services cuts across border. The reason is that you don't need a passport, you don't need a visa for those things to grow.
It creates some semblance of unity and the continent a little smaller.
Exactly.
Like a smaller global
and as such,
village.
Those have grown and they tend to do fairly well. And I think what we need to do is encouragement by giving the proper incentives, economic incentives for these to grow. And we will see the benefit of intra-Africa trade.
Adegbite, you want to add?
Before you come in,
Oh, okay, sure.
quickly point out, the point you made about African Union, I think is very crucial.
Yes.
Their role would be in opening up the borders, creating free movement of people. I know there was a program to launch an African passport. If the program is successful, I think it would help drive intra-African
visa
trade.
restrictions. I know Nigeria is doing
visa
something
restrictions
in that
between the ECOWAS countries and other African countries.
Okay, quickly, we still need to bring Raj in your
Okay.
perspective.
The thing is, we look at it from the quality and quantity of products we produce. In Africa, we need to really improve on what we do. Just as everybody has highlighted, if you look at some of the quality, some of the products that we are not really proud to say this is from Nigeria, this is from South Africa, this is from Kenya. But again, the challenges are there as well as the opportunities. There is enormous opportunities for us to, it's very simple. If we don't move within ourselves, then who will, as I say, if you don't trust yourself, how do you expect outsiders to come and start trading? So we have no choice the way the whole continent is going. We've started with the sub-regional trade. We have West Africa, we have the East Africa. Now let us see how those modules, the entire
yeah,
continent will move.
can feed into that. Raj, let's hear your perspective on that. Why Africa continues to have problems trading with itself. Some believe that there's a problem with the transition from political will to policy action. What is your perspective?
I'm going to come back to the issue of being proud of goods developed in a country at the end. The first thing I would say is that what we need in African countries, which I think would help move this process forward, are these central corridors, these transport corridors. If you look at how difficult it is to cross borders from one border to another, it's not just about visa checks, it's not just about hard infrastructure, it's about a lot of different things. It's about the not only the hard infrastructure, but also the computers that allow you to process information. So you need to take a holistic approach when looking at these transport corridors and cross-border entry and exit points. If you look at one example, I'll give you a practical example. It's a central corridor. It's a multimodal transport system which starts in Dar es Salaam, connects Tanzania with DRC, Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, etc. That is a good example of how the average container processing time has reduced significantly from 29 days to 9 to 11 days, and container capacity has increased because you've taken an integrated approach to developing this transport corridor. So you can't look at border trade just in isolation. You need to have come up with a holistic approach. I want to turn finally, before I move on to give it back to you, is this idea that you need to be proud of products in your country. You can only be proud of a product in your country if that product is actually of good quality. If you look at what happened for products from Japan and China, when I was living in Malaysia 30 years ago, initially no one bought Japanese cars because the products were rubbish. Today, Japanese cars are held as the gold standard for cars across the world. That's because the product itself is much better. So I think African countries need to understand that it's not just about being proud of the product that your country is producing. It's actually need to be proud of a product that is of the quality that people want to buy, that actually has an excellence across borders. Because today we know that we can get products wherever you will around the world that is of the best quality. So we can't just rely on nationalism. Our desires to buy things go across borders. So if I want to buy something from Japan, I want to buy it because it's the best product, not because it's Japanese.
Interesting point Raj makes there about the Japan example. Well, let's go a little deeper into Africa's infrastructure deficit. We know what the rhetoric is. We know what the statistics say right now. According to the World Bank, it's a little over $90 billion a year. But we know what the challenges are, and chief among them is funding, especially access to long-term funding and finding innovative ways to especially bring in the private capital to help the government with this problem. But let's talk about new trends we're seeing in terms of, over the years, all the solutions that have been proffered, even including at the World Economic Forum, what we need to do in terms of funding. At this forum, we always have the private sector, government, so everybody always comes to the drawing board, to the round table to, for their own input in terms of how they can work with the domestic government, who, of course, cannot raise enough funding. So let me start with you, Booker. In terms of new trends, innovations, solutions that appear to be working, that have been proffered and African governments have taken up as viable solutions. What are you seeing so far?
Right. I think as Chamberlain had stated earlier, government budgets is never adequate to address that, and therefore it is always the development financial institutions that tend to have longer term financing to be able to invest in a long-term or long gestation projects such as hydro plants or railroads or whatever that requires long-term construction and a serious complex project management in issues that may arise. And if that is complemented with private equity or private investments, then what you have is that the financing is coming from the development finance institutions, and there are people whose monies are also on the line, and therefore you see higher probability of success or in execution of those projects. And I think that has been demonstrated in other economies, and there is no reason why it shouldn't succeed in Africa. The issue that we have had always is that there is a mismatch where commercial bank funds are being used to do longer term projects, and those have never been successful, and they ought not to be in the equation when you are considering infrastructure financing. The other aspect, in larger population bases like Nigeria, etc., you can also concession and bring in private interests that could actually build out the infrastructure, such as the GE concessioning of the railways. Now, they would make a commitment of $3 billion, like they did in the case of Nigeria, and that actually automatically becomes a win-win situation. An entity like GE understands the commercial viability of such a project and can execute. So that to me means that we are really at the beginning of the boom of infrastructure investments and infrastructure development on the continent.
So obviously, I mean, Chamberlain, it would appear that it's a learning, obviously a learning curve. Many of these solutions are not exactly new, but you know, there's a political will and then there's the actual action. But so for governments like Nigeria who are now physically embarking on these solutions, what do you see that stands out so far?
I'll look at it this way. Let's try to define infrastructure in terms of the sizes, in terms of capital outlay, and an asset class. Public utility, which is basically infrastructure, can actually be broken down in a way that for different markets, you can actually commercialize, whether it's waste management, water supply, and a lot of other transportation infrastructure. Government doesn't have to be in those kinds of spaces. That is manageable, that can actually be handled by local investors, that can be seeded by government or the banks, and that you can easily get private investors, and that has shorter decision periods. For bigger projects like the rail system, ports, and the rest of them, of course, you need much more heavy lifting, and that's where you need the government and development finance institutions, and hopefully bigger pension funds from abroad. But let's try to delineate between infrastructure, size of infrastructure, location of infrastructure, and the kinds of assets we're looking at. So as long as we keep talking about infrastructure in, quote, large format, then you're not going to get it right. Because you could take that same concept, break it down, regionalize it, create different pockets and different markets, and get it right. So you could have a water supply or sanitation system for your local government. You can actually have the same water supply, waste disposal for a small community. And of course, there's so much talk right now about modular refineries, captive power. Lagos has been successful in creating captive power projects.
I need to hear Adegbite from him.
Lagos has done several small captive power projects that are successful, whether it's for street lighting or lighting some regions or even estates.
And we're very lucky that Mr. Adegbite is here today.
Let's look at straight from that perspective.
Share with us, your experience so far. Lagos State example, it's becoming a big success story. We've seen a lot on the infrastructure, on the land infrastructure now, waterways. Tell us in terms of funding, how you're getting funding, and what is the big plan?
Well, I think the basic thing we should look at is area of planning. Even if you have all the funding and you do not have adequate planning, you are likely not to be successful. So once you get your planning correct, things will move as fast as you want. Also, you just mentioned the fact that Africa will probably need over $90 billion annually. But what I'm looking at is even that $90 billion, the little that we have now, if we judiciously apply it properly, a quarter of that $90 billion could be accessed internally. Let me give you an example. If we plan properly and operate the budget the way it should be, $1 worth of investment can, what dollar used to give us previously will go further than what it should be. So looking at Lagos State's model now, you will notice that there has been a lot of infrastructure improvement. What we try to do is to look at frontier communities, as in those communities that will either though have been forgotten, come up with 2 or 3 projects that you wish will impact positively in your area, and then we'll take it off from there. So that's how we started with them, and then we start engaging. So basically, it's looking at the planning as well as looking at how best to do things in terms of how you can move further with the little you have.
Okay, Adegbite, thank you for sharing that with us. You're still watching the Building Africa panel discussion. We're focusing on Africa's infrastructure, the state of Africa's infrastructure. We're speaking to Adegbite Olakunle, Deputy Director at Lagos State Ministry of Waterfront Infrastructure. Also joining us today, Chamberlain Peterside, Managing Director, CEO, Excellent Capital Advisors, Bukar Kyari, Chairman, Nigeria Economic Summit Group, and also Raj Kalusingam, Senior Counsel at Dentons UK. He joins us via Skype from Cambodia. We'll take a break now and continue with our discussion when we come back. Join us again. Welcome back to our special Building Africa debate. Our focus has been on the state of infrastructure in Africa. My guests are Adegbite Olakunle, Deputy Director, Lagos State Ministry of Waterfront Infrastructure. Also joining us today is Chamberlain Peterside, Managing Director, CEO, Excellent Capital Advisors. Also with us today is Bukar Kyari, the Chairman of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group. And joining us via Skype from Cambodia is Raj Kalusingam, Senior Counsel at Dentons UK. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for staying around with us. So we've talked a bit of Building Africa, how Africans are building Africa. We've talked about infrastructure deficit, the solutions that have been proffered over the years, and how these solutions are working for African governments. But let's delve deep now into funding models. Public-private partnerships, private equity, JVs, and also development finance institutions. Bukar, let me start with you. Public-private partnership, it can be quite tricky, and it's actually been very tricky for Nigeria. We were talking earlier about examples that we can point to, and they're quite few. So what continues to be the problem? Is it the structure? Why can't we unbundle it? Why does it remain so complicated for us?
There are 2 kinds of PPP models. One is where the government doesn't put a penny into this project, in which case there is a risk, and the risk is that of continuity, the risk of actually putting hurdles in front of this private entity that have invested so much in the project. The second is where I believe can be successful, which is where the government itself need to have a skin in the game. Therefore, they have to have a percentage of that financing up front, plus then the private entity coming in. And with that sort of a model, and with a revenue share down the road, I think you would see that it is in the best interest of government to see that project succeed. Of course, in Nigeria, there are also political nuances. That is one party changing in power, and would all projects continue? And at the state levels, we've seen some incidents of those sort of projects being jettisoned. But in a case like Lagos, where we have seen continuity of a single party, you'd see that a project can actually go to conclusion, as well as reaping of the benefits. So I think in Africa, the trick is that there has to be something at stake for the government or the governments, and there has to be an airtight agreement that would ensure that should there be any kind of default on the part of government, they would have to pay, and pay dearly for it.
Okay, Chamberlain, in your experience, are there, deals, success stories, and what in your experience, from the private sector, do you see that remains the biggest challenge? Bukar has talked about the fact the government must show that it has something at stake. I would assume that the fact that we have this huge infrastructure deficit, that already tells us that there's a lot at stake. Yeah. But it's mind-boggling sometimes.
I think in my past life as the finance commissioner in Rivers State, I think we had several successful PPP projects, you might say. We had one In Hausen, there was a large-scale housing estate called Taft Golf Estate, costed over $200 million. The role of the government was simple: provide the land to the developer, who happens to be a foreign developer who came into Nigeria for the first time, right into Port Harcourt, wasn't swayed by all the information and all the things that might have happened in terms of security. And over time, of course, he was able to develop different kinds of houses and sold out. The project is actually going into the subsequent phases right now. We also had a shopping mall which brought in Spa into Port Harcourt. It was an abandoned shopping complex built in the 60s. And the company actually came in, took it in that form that it was, totally rebuilt it and turned it around. And right now it houses a spa, a supermarket, a movie theater, and several other entities. It's an example that even any subsequent government would see live and don't touch. Unfortunately, some other projects that hadn't taken off, like the fish farm projects, the banana farm projects, that might have also been quite instrumental in employment creation, didn't quite get the kind of support that it required. So PPP, it's easier said than done in our experience.
But it can be done, because I'm thinking, at what point, maybe usually at what point do things go wrong? What is it that the private investor and the government argue about or can't reach an agreement on that makes the thing stop halfway or something?
The first experience that I had, and the first point is the government being ready enough to vet the proposals from the private sector investors, knowing who comes through your door, knowing their credibility, how are they able to fund, can they manage, what role can they play in concrete terms. If you're able to determine that and let them through the door, then you can go, at least you've solved most of the problems. On the government side, you have to really show good faith. If you're bringing land, you can bring some skin to the game, as Gary said, put up some money, so that you have something at stake. Don't just walk away and say, here's the land, you go figure it out. If those things are gotten right, I think that PPP could be quite successful. Okay, I think
back to the experience of Lagos State government. The government is spending billions and billions of naira on infrastructure, and we know that you're not doing, yes, IGR is high, but we know that the state government isn't doing it alone. So, and I know that in the course of funding infrastructure, there probably have been PPPs in some sectors. What has been experienced so far?
Well, so far, just as everybody has highlighted, PPP, JVs, and all that models have pros and cons. But let me just state for Lagos, what I think builds to the credibility of that is that we do have a specialized office that deals with any form of proposal that you bring. It goes straight to that office, irrespective of whether it is lands, whether it is works. It just goes straight to that global investment office that vets all those, just to address what you were saying earlier. Now, there are a couple of success stories that we have. The Eko Atlantic City will be mentioned as one of them, as well as some other items. But basically, what I see is the legal framework for PPP arrangements is something that we need to strengthen and see the best way we could move forward from the present state we have, and then so that everybody will be confident. Right now, has
that been your experience? What the sticking point has been in your experience?
Yes.
When you get to the
those are the lag that I'm seeing that I can point to.
Okay.
That's the legal framework, something that will give the investors confidence that I think for Lagos State, the best thing that has happened is that over the years there has been some level of continuity.
The rule of law, continuity, at least for the private investors, confidence, and all of that, all rolled into one. And consistency, investors need to always have that. So I'm asking, is that too much?
No, I think that's given, because the question is asked always of, even before we came onto this studio, of why would foreign investors shy away from the shores of a particular country or a particular region or a zone, and it's obvious money goes flows in the direction of least resistance. It's just natural. If that is not there, if there is the tiniest of suggestion that things may be expropriated or whatever, then investors will shy away from the place, even if the return on investment is huge. And to us, that, I think, is one of the key things that governments in Africa need to understand, and that is that you need to be more attractive by saying that we are about rule of law, we respect and we follow through with whatever commitment we give you, etc., etc. Right.
So I'm just, you wanted to add something? The
whole thing can just be wrapped around the legal framework for doing business in any particular state or the country.
Correct.
If, just as I said, if I'm putting X amount of naira and I'm not sure that my X money, my money will come back, the return of investment is key in this whole equation. So. Okay,
so for Nigeria, Chairman, let me ask you, for the best model, appropriate financing model for us, can we lump it all together, or of course, is it project specific?
No, I think
financing model for us.
Yeah, no, the financing model is a function of what I tried to define earlier on, which is the size of the project, in what sector, and in what region. Quite frankly, you're going to have some PPPs or some projects that would never work with a PPP model. So if you take the road network, for instance, in this country, and you wanted to develop, a string of toll roads all around the country, for political reasons, demographic reasons, geographical reasons, you're not going to have all the roads in the country being successful, but you're going to have some key arteries that would work. Same thing with railways.
Okay, but would you say we're actively engaging the sources of funding available to us, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds?
That's a very tricky question because, earlier on...
Many want to invest in greenfield.
Earlier on, we're discussing what is the biggest impediment to foreign capital flow right now to Nigeria. It's forex policy, period. However, domestically, we mustn't forget that we're beginning to see a growth of domestic capital. Now, why is it not being deployed in infrastructure?
Who can answer that question?
To my mind, we know we have 5% of pension assets that is earmarked for infrastructure, but we have only 0.5% that is actually going in there. Most of pension assets, 65%, is in government securities. Government is a big borrower. Government pays decent interest on its on its borrowings, and so the banks, pension funds, and maybe large investors have a better appetite with those kinds of instruments, thereby crowding out other projects that might have been financed, especially infrastructure.
Okay, I don't want us to talk, we've spent a lot of time on infrastructure finance. Let's talk about prioritizing our infrastructure needs, not just in Nigeria, on the African continent. Electricity is top on the table. Power, because if we solve power, so many other things fall into place.
Absolutely.
So it's not a question of, in terms of how we prioritize. Do we know how we should prioritize? In terms of power, electricity,
I think that
ICT?
I've always believed in this concept of one point agenda, and obviously we'll rather take on many things than one thing at a time. If you took power, for instance, we've spent quite a bit of money, 16 billion by some accounts. We still haven't gotten it right. We're still at 4,000 megawatts. Now we're targeting 8,000 megawatts. How do you do that? Is it through the thermal electricity plants that's going to be requiring gas as a feedstock, or are you going to, look at the power mix differently, where you look at solar, you look at, modular refineries, you look at captive power, like we said, and look at coal-fired power plants, for instance. So if you have that breakdown of what the needs are, the geography, and the different markets, you can get it right.
Okay.
Now, what do you prioritize? Is it power, transportation, or housing? That's a different story. I would stick to power.
Okay, I think, so let me bring you in. Lagos is the fifth biggest economy on the African continent, bigger than some African countries on the continent. So how is Lagos State prioritizing its infrastructure needs?
For example, if you ask me, just as I said, power is number one. However, there are some things that are beyond the states, which is, for example, power is only federal government that does. Power and other, but though some states are venturing into that,
which Lagos State has,
I was going to get that. Okay. That we have a couple of IPP around that So far, we have about 5 of them. And now the question again is, what kind of model do you use? Because right now, there are some, the whole of Africa, for example, the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, what we are producing is about what Spain is producing in terms of power output. So we need to look at all those things. Why is it so expensive? Power in Nigeria, for example, what we pay for power is far more expensive than what other regions pay. So we need to look at the appropriate pricing and appropriate models, so that all those things will fit in, and then we'll be able to get there.
Okay.
So that's
let me bring in Raj. Raj, weighing on this for us, in terms of how Africa is prioritizing infrastructure development, what trends do you see, and what has been the experience as you deal in your dealings with the private sector?
Across Africa, the biggest need is power, but actually you also need to look at the other big stumbling block for development of African economies, which is transport, ports, and logistics. So there is a general concerted effort on these areas to try and move Africans up the value chain. Now, I think one of the challenges is how do you best do this? And actually, what someone once said to me that, a good project, you can always raise finance. So I think often the issue is not that you can or can't raise finance. The issue is it a good project? Has it been well structured? Has it got the right incentives? Has it got the right partners? So those are the kind of things that actually African governments have the ability to actually craft and design projects that actually will give investors the right returns. And whether it's power, whether it's transport, ports, logistics, etc., these can be done. It's not, it's been done before. I think one of the questions that you talked about earlier was, what are the sources of finance? Finance is there, whether it's private equity, whether it's development finance institutions, whether it's commercial banks. Finance is there for the right projects, which have the right structures, which will give them the right returns. The question is, how do you best create these projects? And then you go back to the very beginning, which is that how do you best develop these projects? And that's where the blockage is, that there isn't enough development finance to actually develop these projects. And I think you're seeing some innovative solutions today, whereby more and more funds are being created to actually provide these development finance, that has the expertise to provide development finance. And I think that's where the bottleneck is. The other thing I would say is that to be able to deliver these projects, you actually need to have the right regulatory framework. And you actually need to have money within the system. If you look at the Nigerian power sector today, there isn't enough money in the system. The DISCOs are not paying the GENCOs are not being paid, and the government's not paying the DISCOs. So you just haven't got enough money in the system. So you need to unlock that bottleneck to be able to give investors the confidence that no matter how good the structures are, that actually fundamentally the power sector is sound, and there's enough money in the system that allows these projects to actually have a reasonable chance of getting the requisite return. Hold
that thought for us. Let's move on to another issue that we're going to look at here. That's international partnerships. Nigeria, so we're looking at Nigeria versus China, Nigeria versus the US. Now, Nigeria's relationship with China, or China's relationship with Africa has been quite controversial. I mean, just recently, in the last couple of years, we've seen China step up in the loans and in its partnership with Nigeria. We have the Real just signed a few weeks ago with Nigeria, and in all the African countries. And then on the other side, the US, that has been going on for a good number of years. But things appear to be changing now with the new Trump administration. We hear Trump is proposing a 28% cut to foreign aid and all of that. So, but are we better off? I don't want to take a position. I'm not taking a position here. But Kerry, let me start with you in terms of China's foray into the African continent, the benefits so far, and how Africa has been responding to that relationship.
I believe that Africa must look at its interest first and foremost. And that is that if we have foreign partners that are willing to come and invest, of course you would always ask what their motives are. And that is for you to sieve out for you to understand the ramifications of those relationships. But at the end of the day, it is in our best interest to have friends across the oceans that are willing to come and journey with us in our economic development process. Now, if you decide that you don't want another person to come and intervene in a field that you used to dominate, I'm sorry, you are more or less becoming a loser. And am I saying this to the US or Europeans? If they feel that the embrace that China is making or moving towards Africa is detrimental to their cause, then they need to come to the table with better offer. At the end of the day, it is all about which one of the offers is in our best interest, and that's something that we need to tease out.
Chamberlain, quickly, just 1 minute, actually, we're almost out of time.
Yes, I would say that traditionally we've had the colonial masters or colonial powers who funded Africa's infrastructure. They basically built the roads and the ports, British and the French. From that point on, you had US, which became a strong economy, playing a much bigger role. Right now, the trend is changing, and China has gained quite a bit of financial muscle, and they want global influence, and they want to export, and naturally to lead them to export and investing in infrastructure all across Africa, and I don't think anything is wrong with that.
Adegbite, do you have the same feeling too? I mean, would China be a good partner for Lagos State as you spend more on infrastructure?
China will be, but my take is we need to have an African agenda also. It depends on what you are bringing on the table. If we just take everything who like and sink, and then we might end up being the loser, as I said. We get dictated to here. But if we have our own agenda and then protect our own line, then we are open to whether America or China both have what they are coming in for. They are not coming in for free, so we also must protect our shores.
Raj, let's hear your perspective on this. So whenever there's talk about China doing business with Africa, there's always that undertone of suspicion compared to when the US is mentioned. What is your perspective on this?
Look, I think it's something like this. It's up to African governments to choose what's best for them. And whether it's China or US, as earlier said, it doesn't really matter. It's actually who wants to come and invest in that country, and who's prepared to put money, labor, skills, technology transfer, etc. into that country. And then it's up to Africans and African governments to actually structure a deal that actually works for them. And it's for us, or Africans, to actually say, well, okay, if you're going to come and invest in this project, we want to see technology transfer. We want to see employment of local people. We want to see all the things that we would expect in terms of moving the country up in terms of development. And if that's China, fantastic. And if it's in America, fantastic as well. I think the reality is that America is looking inward and China is looking outward. China needs Africa as much as Africa needs China. So if China comes along and provides Africa with money and skills and competency to develop its infrastructure, then Africa should take it, but take it on terms that it wants, rather than on terms that China is giving it, because China needs Africa as much as Africa needs.
Okay, Raj, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been a pleasure connecting with us all the way from Cambodia. Thank you so much, gentlemen. A special thank you to you for talking to us, joining us today on the Building Africa debate. I've been speaking to Adegbite Olakunle, Deputy Director, Lagos State Ministry of Waterfront Infrastructure. Also joining us for today's conversation was Chamberlain Peterside, Managing Director, CEO, Excellent Capital Advisors. Also, we've had Buka Kyari, Chairman of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, and Raj Kulasingam, Senior Counsel at Dentons UK, who joined us from Cambodia. We'll be looking at, of course, the Building Africa debate today, focusing on the state of Africa's infrastructure. Thank you so much for being a part of it. From me and the team, it's bye for now.